Education on the one hand, academia on the other, neither appears to be a happy place at the moment, or at least neither is delivering for our young people, I would say. There were the reports earlier in the year about the rising levels of anxiety and depression reported among school pupils on account of lockdown. After 2 years of homeschooling, the necessary catch-up is even more of a mountain to climb. I'm old enough to remember when a Scottish education was something to boast about anywhere in the world. Last month came the news the UK Education Secretary Nadeem Zahawi had been asked to give advice to the Scottish Government amid reports of literacy and numeracy standards in freefall in Scotland. Then last week I read about York University Archaeology Department putting a trigger warning on one of its courses, warning would-be students that they might see images of human remains. And the Theology Department at Glasgow University was warning its students that the story of Jesus Christ might be upsetting. These are just a random selection of stories that hardly show education in this country in the best light. I'm joined now by education specialist and GBNews regular Tom Buick, and by Chris McGovern from the Campaign for Real Education to discuss where we are now. Good evening and welcome to you both.
Hi, Neil.
Good evening.
You hearing me? Tom, I'll come first of all to you. Is the education establishment, for want of a better word, simply failing our kids at the moment?
Well, if you look at the international evidence that's collected by the likes of the Programme for International Assessment, or so-called PISA, our education system has stagnated in 20 years. And actually, you touched on this on your introduction. When surveyed for things like life skills and life satisfaction, we come at the bottom of these international league tables. And that suggests to me, prima facie, that we're clearly letting down a generation of young people, that we're not supporting them through the curriculum in the way that other countries manage to do.
Chris, if I could come to you, have we forgotten or somehow unlearned, perhaps, how to teach basic literacy and numeracy?
We have. If we go back 30, 40 years when our campaign for real education was set up, we were arguing then, for example, that we mustn't move away from teaching children the sounds of letters, or called phonics. And in those days, the children were being told to just recognise individual words. It was a catastrophe, and now I think all commentators recognise the importance of phonics. But yeah, things have gone backwards. We're the only, according to the OECD, the great number crunchers internationally, we're the only country in the developed world where grandparents outperform their grandchildren in basic skills. And if you go back even 70 years, Singapore, which is currently more or less at the top of the international league tables, they were basically illiterate in 70 years ago. They were 95% illiteracy. And we were way ahead. Now that we're way behind, we're about 3 years behind Singapore in standards. So is there a problem? There really is. But look, it represents a triumph for modern thinking. It represents a triumph for the educational establishment, what has been called the blob. They want this. What you're criticising on this show is what the educational establishment strives for. They see it as a triumph. We're all doing very well, according to them. They are very self-congratulatory. But in the real world, children are unhappy, and one of the reasons why they're unhappy is they're not well educated, and they can't get jobs and they can't do jobs. And we're going to be competing in an international field, and our children are going to fall behind. So, yeah, we need lots of immigrants, because then they could be trained up. They are better educated than our own children. So, with the arguments to and fro on immigration, we know what they are. But I will tell you one thing, we need skilled workers in this country. And if we can't train our own, we are going to be dependent on immigrants. So that's where we stand.
Tom, is that the case? Is the establishment, so-called, that we're referring to, are they self-congratulatory and persuaded that what they have done is the right thing?
Well, in a sense, where I agree with our fellow guest is that we need to focus on the basics of education. I mean, just going back to those OECD figures, out of 79 countries, we're 18th in maths, we're 15th in reading. And I don't think, actually, the education establishment can just say, well, that's in part to do with the fact that we don't spend enough on education, we don't invest enough on education. Actually, only Norway, Chile and New Zealand is ahead of us in terms of the percentage of our national income we spend on education. And that's included, obviously, in Scotland that you referenced earlier, where it's been a disaster over the last 15, 20 years with the curriculum for excellence. So there isn't very much to write home about. I think where I part company, from a fellow guest there, is that, I don't think the answer actually, every time there's a periodic crisis in British education, is to look back to the past and say that what we need is a more traditional education. In fact, if you look at, for example, the English national curriculum today, you will see striking similarities with the 1904 curriculum. It's extremely traditional, and indeed it's got even more traditional since Michael Gove was Secretary of State. So I think we need to look in more detail at the nature of the assessment, the curriculum, the fact that children learn in different styles. In my profession, we weren't talking about neurodiversity in education 5-6 years ago. We are now. And I think that relates obviously to issues like the examination system and whether that's fit for purpose for the demands of the 21st century.
Chris, how do you respond to that? It's demonstrably the case that we're in an increasingly technologically dependent world. A world in which children, young people have to learn to be simpatico with computers and technology and the rest. Is it the case that there's, rather than looking back at traditions, is it even worse in a sense? Do we need to start again? Having watched, like you say, you referenced Singapore passing us, lapping us on the track. How do we catch up and get back to where we were?
Yeah, I know I sound very old-fashioned, and people say I'm looking back to a golden age. But what I would say is that if you go to Singapore or Shanghai or Japan or South Korea, they use the teaching methods which we used in the 1950s. So whilst it sounds archaic and old-fashioned, what I say, it's only old-fashioned here. It's not old-fashioned in Singapore. They say, no, you're absolutely right. And I caught a bit of a row 30-odd years ago when we changed the exam system. We got rid of what was then the GCE O-level, and we replaced it with a more all-ability exam, GCSE. But if you go to Singapore, what are they using? Well, they're using the O-level, the old system, which we say is old-fashioned. But we ban it in this country. But we make it in this country at Cambridge, and we export it to our economic rivals. So, yeah, I don't think that education has changed so much. Of course, we need to embrace new technology, but Britain, the UK, is not behind in embracing the new technology. We use it more than most countries in the world. Our children are addicted. It's like educational cocaine. Our kids get masses and masses of the new technology. If you go to Singapore, South Korea, they get some, but they don't get as much. And international research has shown that you can have too much of this addiction to the technology, and it has harmful effects. So I would say we need to draw examples from the past. But when I'm talking about the past, it ain't the past in Singapore. It's not the past in Shanghai. And we come down to one key thing in education. It's about the quality of the teaching and the quality of the teachers. Go to some countries, Finland's an example, which does reasonably well. They recruit from their top 10% of graduates. We recruit mainly from the bottom 20%. We need high-quality people, because I taught for 35 years in all sorts of schools, large comprehensives of 2,000, and also in posh private schools. I've seen the best and I've seen the worst. I've seen the children who've been very working class, hard up, like myself, in fact, my own background. I've seen the poshes of the posh. But ultimately, the only thing that matters is the quality of the teaching. Did you know, for example, according to the OECD, the children of the street cleaners in Singapore, the children of the workers in Singapore, they are ahead on average of our kids who go to the poshes of the posh schools. Those kids at the Westminsters and the Eatons and the Cheltenham's Ladies College, they're behind, or they're no better than the children of the manual workers in Singapore. You come back to why is that? And part of it, the reason, is because of the teaching methods we use, which are very modern, but they don't work very well. And we work with young offenders in our organisation. We find the prisoners, the young people who are in prison, they are mostly illiterate and innumerate. It is a terrible scandal. And by the way, there's a law of gravity in all of this, and the law is that whatever I say, whatever anybody else says, whatever Michael Gove might say, and I advised Michael Gove and other prime ministers before, I advised various prime ministers before Gove's time. There's one law, and it's immutable in education: the blob always wins. Michael Gove lost, and every other education secretary lost. The only one I worked with, and I've worked with 20 or so over the years, was probably Blunkett. And Plunkett was, I thought, a decent man, did a reasonable job, and he ended up locked in a broom cupboard at the NUT, the National Union of Teachers Conference, for his own safety. It's pretty tough out there, and voices like mine are crushed. Remember, I was someone who moved from the state to the private sector because I was forced out. That's where we are.
Let me broaden this out to my guests here in the studio with me, Emma Burnell. Listening to that's a very strong case, a very passionate case being made there by Chris McGovern.
Certainly a passionate case.
Would you say there's an ideological problem in our education system? We talk a lot about capture of the institutions. Is there something in the whole approach that has gone wrong in the last couple of generations? Our children are demonstrably falling behind.
I think there is something that's gone wrong in the last couple of generations, but I think Chris and I would disagree radically on what that is. I think that we have got far too invested in measuring how we achieve what are essentially tools. Reading, writing and arithmetic are really, really, really important. And we absolutely have to teach children those things. But they are not, in and of themselves, an education. An education is a grounding in how to be a grown-up. And how to be a grown-up includes imagination and using those tools. And all we've done is focus on league tables and trying to grade ourselves on exactly how many people can pass which phonics level without thinking more and more imaginatively on how they actually use that stuff. And we talked in the last section about asking questions. If we can't teach our kids to ask those questions in the right way, how can we expect them to hear the answers properly?
But Emma Webb, it's obviously not working. You do what I agree. Fundamentally, I agree that you want imaginative children who've been given the basic tools and they have inquiring minds and they can learn how to think, not what to think. But the children are measurably falling behind and have been for lifetimes.
Yeah, I think, one aspect of this is I think that not only at schools but also at universities we need to find a balance between rigour and creativity, because often I think the education system squeezes creativity out of children and young adults as well. But I think fundamentally our expectations are too low, and not just our educational expectations, but our expectations of how mature children should be by a certain stage. And when we talk about teaching children to be adults, that's something that should simply be in the environment. They should be taught to be independent individuals and independent thinkers. And I think that fundamentally the issue is, and this goes back to what the gentleman was saying from the Campaign for Real Education, is that our expectations have slipped, that everything, going back to the first segment, that we discuss condescension, everything has become extremely dumbed down and the expectations of adults is low, never mind the expectation of children.
Tom, if I could come back to you, we're running quite tight to time here. Tom Buick, education specialist. It strikes me that it's quite often the case is quite often made that parents have a role in this, but presumably this has been going on for so long. The decline is so dangerously set in that we must now be dealing with the children of parents whose education has fallen so far behind what might otherwise have been expected that even parents might be powerless to help.
Talk ourselves into a bit of a council of despair. I mean, intergenerational inequality, issues around parenting is not new. I mean, I'm someone that failed actually all my O-levels all those years ago. I was the last year of that cohort. Today I represent the examination boards in my day job, right? So, this idea that there's a sort of fatalism around people's educational destinations is just not the case. But just sort of picking up on comments there from the two Emmas, they're absolutely right. We've got to get this balance right between so-called rigour in the curriculum and creativity. I mean, I'm with the late Sir Ken Robinson, who talked about the need in the 21st century for a real paradigm shift in our education system, in the sense of it was designed in 1870 for the demands of the first industrial revolution, obviously tinged with social, liberal, progressive values, but looking forward to the challenges of the next 50 years in the so-called fourth industrial revolution, that is going to demand huge change to the whole nature of institutions, how people learn, their relationship with those institutions. That is really the big challenge I see coming down the track.
Challenges, there absolutely undoubtedly are. Chris McGovern from the Campaign for Real Education, Tom Buick, education specialist, thank you for your time this evening.